Welcome back in, everyone, to our Hangout series, part of Innovation for the Nation. We hope you're enjoying the virtual summit here. By the reports I'm getting, the chat rooms are quite active, so I'm glad that is working out for all of you. You're keeping me busy here with the hashtag IFTN13, so keep your tweets coming across. That's how we're getting a lot of the questions and comments into our guests on this Hangout series. We're going to continue on the map front. This session, public maps at scale. Last session, if you were with us, Scott and Dave were on board, and we were focused on kind of some of the internal uses of geospatial technologies and how teams were accelerating, collaborating, and then enabling the decision-making internally. What we want to do in this session is kind of branch out a bit, talk about a new program, which is Google Maps Engine Public Data Program, really just being announced. This is for government data kind of providers, aggregators that have this public, that have this data and information and want to make it more discoverable on the public front for the consumers, for the users to access. This program is invite only, so we're going to address that aspect of the program a bit later on in this chat, but we're going to take the first 20 minutes or so to talk with Jordan Breckenridge, the Google Maps product manager, to get an idea of what this program is all about. And again, I promise he will tell you how some of you may be able to get involved with this program, and you'll be thankful, if you do want to get involved, that you joined us here today in this Hangout. So Jordan, with that, welcome, sir. We appreciate your time, and I'll put things in your hands.
Thanks, James. And as James mentioned, what I'll talk through is a lot of sort of how we see public data and public maps and sort of the challenges our users face in discovering that content and getting access sort of as engaged citizens, stakeholders, or others that need access to the authoritative public content that governments and sort of authoritative providers make available. I'm going to talk through just sort of a bit of context and a bit of sort of where and how we've come to this set of challenges and sort of how we're thinking about helping our users, better enabled, have better tools and better access to authoritative content. But before we do that, I want to take a step back and talk about sort of Google Maps, 8 or so years ago when it first launched. And what you see there in front of you is essentially that product. And you'll notice that there's sort of some key things missing, including, for example, the rest of the world. The first launch of Google Maps was revolutionary in that you not only didn't have to wait 10 seconds for that first map to load, you didn't have to wait 10 seconds for each subsequent pan and zoom. By pre-rendering essentially all of Google Maps, the experience was very fluid, and sort of a new form of almost web application was born as a result of those very dynamic experiences. It included a bunch of very interesting and good geospatial content, but it was essentially limited by what we could essentially bring to the map and produce ourselves or work with providers to basically improve our base map. If you flash forward to 2013, earlier this year we announced the new version of Google Maps, which includes a much more dynamic, rich, comprehensive experience than even ever before. And the kind of key aspect of this is no longer are we pre-rendering one set of tiles for everyone. We are now rendering dynamically a set of tiles for you. So the map that you see is different than the map that the person next to you sees. Based on who you are and what you're interested in and what you click on, the map caters to those things. So for example, in this case, if you were to click on a sushi restaurant that you're interested in, related restaurants might pop out, and other unrelated restaurants might go away. Roads might be dynamically highlighted to show the way from your home to that restaurant in question, and other things might change based on your social network or your friends, what they like, what they don't like. But the intent here is to provide a really rich, compelling, immersive experience that includes not just sort of the core map data that you traditionally expect to see, but also, for example, street view imagery, photos, reviews, content, and so on. And it's almost despite all this effort and despite all this focus, there is still a lot of mapping content that's hard for us to bring about and sort of improve our user experiences. People or data that people think about and search for is still a challenge for us to put on the map. Google Maps today serves over 1 billion users. On a weekly basis, there is approximately 1 billion people accessing a Google map either on Google properties or embedded elsewhere on the web. And this is a huge channel. It's obviously a very familiar set of products that people are used to interacting with. Geoliteracy is, as a result, very mainstream at this point. People understand, for example, what a zoom navigation control does. They understand how to pan a map. They understand what an info window is. It's essentially a consumer space. Everyone essentially has a map in their pocket now with their smartphone and so on and so forth. But again, there is still a lot of content that is very difficult to find and very difficult to access. Here's an example. Several weeks ago, when the Black Forest fires were hitting Colorado, this is the kind of content that we wouldn't traditionally have on a Google map. And in this case, a particular concerned citizen, essentially went to Twitter, was reading the local sheriff's department tweets, and essentially cobbling together what he believed to be the official evacuation map at that point in time. And he was doing it dynamically in a Google consumer product. And for that period of time, this was one of the best sources of sort of what the state of evacuations was, and it was being shared virally in the media and on Facebook, on Twitter, and it became sort of this definitive thing. But this is an example of where Google historically wouldn't have had the best content because it's very temporal in nature. It's obviously a changing, dynamic situation, but also, we're not going to necessarily have the people on the ground in all cases to get this content surfaced. And if even it were more static content, it might be more difficult for us to establish those pipelines and those feeds, appropriately. And the thing is, we see this time and time again. This is a time series chart from Google My Maps, which is a feature of Google Maps to create a custom map. And these are almost all examples where our base map or our core mapping product in some way didn't meet the user needs, and so they took to this custom mapping product to basically build out the map extensions, if you will, for how this content would be more relevant to them, whether it was available beds in a shelter situation after the Japanese earthquake, or evacuation routes, for example, in that last example, or where are my loved ones? Where are the people that are missing? Where were they last seen? There's all sorts of examples like that where our traffic and our products almost mirrors sort of things that are happening around the world where we have good content, but it's still not enough. And when we talk about organizing the world's information, broadly from a Google perspective, we mean the world's information, and that includes, for example, all the geospatial information. If people are coming to Google and looking for population densities or obesity scores or road closures, we typically aren't going to provide a great map experience today for those people because we may not have that content, or more likely the people in this room essentially have that content. You, as these authoritative data providers, are often those that have access and maintain and in many ways try to make your content more discoverable. A lot of what we're talking about today is essentially how do we marry and match sort of the users that are coming to us looking for these categories of geospatial information with you, the providers of that content, and make sure that sort of that channel and that experience is successful for the users that are searching that, the concerned citizens, the educational institutions, the NGOs, the other agencies, at different levels of government. How do we marry that and make that distribution channel work? Google Maps Engine is our platform for custom mapping. It is essentially exposing our Google Maps and Earth infrastructure to external users so that they can create custom maps at Google scale. And we are announcing today a public data program that is invitation only, that allows you to get access to Maps Engine to better publish and make your content discoverable in Google products like Maps and Earth. And the essential premise of the program is that you can upload or synchronize using APIs your geospatial content with our cloud. We enable you to build maps that are to your satisfaction with your descriptions and your attribution, and then publish them to essentially any of our endpoints. So regardless of whether it's a web client, a Google Earth experience, or a mobile device, that content is surfaceable and more discoverable as a result of it being essentially included in sort of these consumer experiences where users are turning to Google to look for something and not finding it. And so this program essentially grants you access to Maps Engine to sort of meet these types of use cases. And I'm going to talk through sort of about the sort of experiences and the sort of desires and the sort of key aspects of what we're trying to do here. This program and sort of this set of use cases that we see sort of unsatisfied in our users' eyes are often categories of content that are not quite as mainstream as the more typical sort of Google Maps type use cases. And in this case, I'm showing an example here. This was a few weeks ago, I believe it was created, again, unofficially by not the authoritative provider, but they essentially laid out where citizens in Los Angeles could go to escape the heat wave that was going on. including addresses, hours, and essentially, allowing this content to be more almost casually surfaced based on this particular point in need. And if someone were looking for this content, making sure that they could find it more easily than, for example, looking at a table or a document of some sort that was less of a map visualization. And essentially the program here is to not just reach those users, but essentially take advantage of Google Maps, our sort of world-class base map, our imagery, everything else, and sort of paint the map and the sort of the visualizations that you think are relevant to your users. In this case, I'm showing USGS topographical data superimposed in Google Earth to demonstrate that, obviously this works for imagery as well as more traditional vector point-based data sets. We're taking the sort of challenge away from having to figure out how to layer and mosaic and feather and really blend this sort of very cohesive set of imagery into one sort of seamless user experience that doesn't involve, for example, downloading files that the end user wouldn't understand. If you want to, for example, understand if your house is in a floodplain, it's a much more coherent experience to try to do that in the context of a web-based mapping app or Google Earth, for example, than trying to sort of point, click, and navigate around a series of files in a folder structure. The intent here as well is to allow you to exercise control over your content. So you get to choose the styling, you get to choose how it's described and attributed, you get to pick the license that essentially it's exposed under. If you want to make your content public domain, we want to support you in that. If you don't, we understand. And essentially allow you the opportunity to put your content forth to improve its discoverability and basically improve sort of your citizens and our users' experiences when trying to figure out, for example, where is the nearest service center, or what is the average obesity or education level in my community. And essentially make that content much, much more discoverable than it's been historically. And because this is built on the same infrastructure that is used to serve Google Maps and Earth, you can do things like, for example, update dynamically the content as it changes. And so, for example, if you have, in this case, I'm showing historic unemployment data, but this could just as easily be traffic levels or taxation-related content or what have you. But essentially the goal here is that if you have systems on-premise or legacy systems that you feel should be better enabled for discovery, we can help you synchronize those systems to the cloud and make that content more relevant and accessible to your citizens. And we do this at tremendous scale. Because this is, again, built on the same infrastructure, seeing thousands of queries per second is not that uncommon for us. And we have two examples here sort of cited. One is a set of imagery-related assets that were produced and made available during Hurricane Sandy by NOAA, in particular from the federal government, and surfaced via Google Crisis Maps. And then a second example, again, NOAA/NASA making available a public domain data set that we put on top of our mapping products via Maps Engine, and it got virally picked up by media outlets and sort of hit this 1700 QPS level. This is pretty typical for us, and definitely not the most extreme cases we've seen. We regularly, as Google, see queries and see activities in the millions of QPS. But it kind of goes to show that part of what we're trying to do here is not just make your content discoverable, but also make it accessible by virtue of the fact that you're riding on top of the same infrastructure that's used to serve all of Google's consumer properties. And so with that, I'd like to kind of close and open up for questions. But before I do that, I want to sort of just put the plug in to allow you to participate. And we would like to talk to more of you and understand your use cases and your needs and sort of the citizens and other groups that you're trying to reach with your data but having challenges. We have a no-cost way essentially for you to start and surface your content in Google Maps and Earth with sort of your styling and licensing control. And there's a link there at the bottom, goo.gl/NYWY2M4, and I think there'll be a little thing showing up at some point in this webcast to make sure that that's clear and accessible. But if you lose the invitation or you mistranscribe it or something, you can reach us at publicmaps@google.com, and there'll be that email address will be popping up in a second here. But essentially, this is a way for you to get access to Google Maps Engine to surface your public content better in our products and make it more accessible so that when your users, your citizens, come to Google looking for their content, they find what they're looking for, and they find it from you, the authoritative providers, and not potentially someone else who may have out-of-date content or content that's less qualitative or quality controlled than, for example, the content that you have. And with that, I think that's basically it. So James, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, Jordan, cool. And we'll leave some of the contact information we have up on the screen right now. That way people can jot that down. And you can still get questions into us, hashtag IFTN13. And let me ask you this about the program. State, local, federal, all eligible to take part here?
Yeah, definitely. We're looking for content that the public is looking for and that you think is satisfying some need where discovery is a challenge today. And we definitely don't bias toward the size of the organization, what tier of government. We're broadly focused on how do you make public maps more discoverable.
There are some comments out there. It'd be great to see groups like FEMA, the CDC, providing this type of content. Is that happening now? Is that a hope of yours?
Yeah, no, definitely. We have active conversations with many organizations. I mean, I think I showed a bunch of examples that were crisis related, for example, and that does happen to be a very sort of top category of sort of query that we get. Like at time of crisis, it's not uncommon to see millions of queries and so on, looking for where is the evacuation route? Is my loved one safe? Where do I find emergency shelters? Where is that source of water that I need? Those are things that happen, but on a day-to-day basis, sort of outside the crisis context, we see lots of other categories where it's equally challenging. Like what is the boundaries of my school district? Which school is my child eligible for? What is the obesity rate in my community? What is the education level in my community? Like there's a ton of other sort of more mainstream content that is long tail that doesn't have those massive spikes that crisis has. But we're having conversations with a variety of organizations, and part of why we're opening this up here is we recognize that many of you in the audience are looking to ways to solve this challenge, and we want to essentially partner with organizations like yours to sort of have these conversations and understand sort of what problems you face and what opportunities we can collaboratively work on.
To move even further away from emergency type things, I'm assuming some local government could decide, hey, we'd like to surface. We get a lot of inquiries about dog parks or something like that, right?
Exactly. That's exactly the use case, and clearly the emergency cases are important to us, and we have a lot of special programs devoted to emergency stuff today. It's more challenging for us to scale if we have to be the curator essentially of all those maps, and we essentially want to enable people who have the data, who have the understanding of the data, and have the use cases in mind to help us understand where this could help their organizations.
Let me get to a couple other questions that I've jotted down here. One of them, a GSI individual, are those the only folks that you're looking to kind of make these contributions? Can other folks be involved?
Yeah, GIS individuals. I assume is what you.
Yes,
But no, we are interested in high-value public content that has a geospatial component, where you believe your citizens, your stakeholders are looking for that content. And if you're a community manager or a nonprofit or an educational institution, you believe you have content that sort of fits that description, we want to talk to you. It so happens that some of that content's in GIS systems, but I imagine much of it's in spreadsheets or in paper-based maps, for example, today.
I'm assuming the ease of use. I mean, just back to your example of the evacuation. I mean, that was just done on the fly. It doesn't seem like this is going to be something that's going to tax a lot of resources for a team that wants to engage here.
Correct. And that's the intent here, is that we provide sort of the tools that we use to essentially produce public maps and custom maps to the organization and put them into the hands of the people that can do that essentially.
Question came in, I think it's appropriate here. I saw this at the tail end again of our previous session where we were talking to some of your colleagues, and this was about more internal use. But the idea of some of this GIS data, zoning data, property data, some stuff is kind of public, some's private, some's on the edge. How do you juggle that and help teams juggle that, make the determination, make sure that something that really should have been private is not made public, that type of thing?
Definitely. So I think in the prior session, Google Maps Engine was probably touched upon. I mean, the intent of Google Maps Engine, again, is to expose our geo-infrastructure as an end-user service or a developer service. When you put content in Maps Engine, you get to decide, for example, what the access control is. Is this a private map? Is this a public map? If it's a private map, who are the names of the individuals that get to edit it? Who are the names of the individuals that get to view it, for example? This program that I've talked through is essentially the public incarnation of a version of Maps Engine that lets you put content into, for example, Google Maps and Earth. But the version that was discussed more broadly in the last session is essentially the sort of enterprise class version that allows you to put, for example, tighter controls around your private maps. The intent here, though, is that we're giving access to an account here that works for public maps essentially. There's also a version of that same product or an upgrade path essentially to allow you to have private controls around that same data if you have those use cases. We want to make sure that at a minimum we solve sort of this public use case because it benefits our users very broadly. But we also want to encourage you, if you have those private use cases, to think about sort of how it could be applied there.
Larry is out there asking you this question. Can we publish content that is georeferenced using NAD83? And you might be able to explain that better than I. I know it has to do with some type of GPS type coding and information.
Yeah, so typically Google follows a set of standards with respect to geospatial projections and other things. Those are some details we can get into, but it's typically the Google Maps Engine-based compliance standards, and I can actually forward around a Help Center article later on that kind of defines not just the projections that are supported, but also, for example, the file formats, the API schematics, if people are interested in that kind of content.
Let's get into a best practice question, because someone might be listening and saying, hey, this is kind of cool. We would like to have some more of our data accessible and be able to have that content found. But currently how we have collected that data might have some private information kind of tied to it, or information that you don't want to be made public. So best practice, go through that data, kind of clean it, scrub it, start fresh, forget the old stuff you had, to start collecting data new, but adjust your forms, data collection, so it's clean as it is, so that it would be appropriate for the program?
I think there's a bunch of different ways to approach that. It does probably depend a lot on the situation and the nature of the data. And also, I would guess, probably the cost in which that data was acquired. I think it really does vary based on the situation. We've seen examples where organizations have a scrubbed version already that they just want to surface, and we've seen other organizations essentially either clone or fork that data set to produce sort of that new sort of anonymized, no personal information version. And we've seen other organizations, for example, create aggregates. Like, for example, rather than disclosing like the sort of individual level elements of a data set, they prefer instead, for example, to roll it up and display zip code wide averages or cumulative counts, or something that represents sort of the the spirit of the data, but at a level where there's not as much concern, for example, at the privacy level.
Let me jump back over to Twitter here. Hashtag IFTN13. Has Google Maps encountered any communications challenges between technicians and users? So someone's trying to create something, run into a little block. How can they reach out, get support? Has that been anything?
We've thought about this a lot. And some of this is sort of ongoing things that we're working on. The end user experience for discovering this content is obviously something we're also thinking about. And how do you essentially allow the sort of the provider to have sort of a channel direct to the end user, not just for support, but also for ongoing dialogue about what's important, what's needed. We're thinking through different models to do that, but we essentially want to enable an end user two-channel conduit for communication and not necessarily get in the way of that. The mental model that we're thinking about this is very much sort of YouTube for maps. Like, we want to essentially allow this sort of discovery experience, this sort of sharing experience, the recommended content experience you find in YouTube, but enable it all around geospatial content. So it's just much easier, much more consumer-oriented, and a much more sort of channel-friendly way to get this content in the hands of the right people.
Travis, wondering if you're actively working with statewide GIS councils or bodies. Is it just kind of one by one? Do you have groups that are coming together brainstorming?
We have bits of both at both the federal and the state level. It does vary a lot based on the organizations we're talking to. And in general, like, Google actively participates in those organizations at a much broader level. In the context of this program, we've been somewhat limited in our ability to reach out, and that's essentially why we're putting this message out here today, to start some of those conversations. So if you have those kinds of topics or you have ideas for whom we should be talking to, we would love to hear that feedback.
You see, Randy and a few folks want that URL again. So it's the Google URL that you see on the screen right now, the goo.gl, and then /n WI2M4. And that is what it is. When we get off this event, Randy, I'll have an easier opportunity. I'll get over on Twitter and respond to you and the whole chain out there. But that is it. The public data program sign up, that URL that's on the screen for all of you is the one to use. More information, public maps at google.com. And Jordan was kind enough to put his email address out there. So if you want that and reach out directly to him, you can. Jordan, I believe you're going to be hanging out as well. One of our featured chats coming up when we're done here. So folks, if you have additional questions, you want to get a little more information, you'll be able to hang out with Jordan for about another 30 minutes or so. That's pretty much going to wrap up our session for this time around. We've got one more final session for today, and that's going to be coming up just over a half hour from now. We're going to be talking, last couple sessions have been about maps, geospatial, moving on to Chromebooks. And you'll be hearing about a library system up in the Portland area that is focusing on the use of Chromebooks as a loaner machine out to their patrons that are coming into the libraries. While it's a library story, I also think it's got a lot of benefits to anyone else in a public agency that may have a need to put a machine into someone else's hands to use. It could be filling out forms as they come into a building or something like that. So I think there's some interesting things we'll be talking about that again coming up at 2 o'clock. I hope you all have been seeing some of the marquee messages inviting you to different chats and hangouts that are going on in our virtual environment. And then our final remarks for the day. I want you to be on board for the final session. Immediately following that, we'll stay in the hangout, and we're going to have closing remarks from Scott McIntyre, the Director for State and Local Government with Google. Scott was actually on board with one of the scheduled chats early this morning as our event kicked off. We'll get his kind of thoughts on what he has seen and heard throughout the day here, talk a little bit about kind of where we're at, preview a little bit of tomorrow as well, because we've got a full slate on board for tomorrow, more hangouts to come. So with that, we'll wrap up this session. Jordan, do appreciate it. We're going to let him get on over to the scheduled chat in the networking lounge. As always, keep that hashtag up, IFTN13 on Twitter. We'll keep getting questions and comments in, and we'll see you back here in just about 30 minutes for our next session.
Thanks, James.